Hi, this is a recording of an event that took place on the 13th of June 2013 at Vinopolis in London. This was a day that we organised called Implementing and Securing a Resilient Network Services Infrastructure, designed to showcase a couple of solutions that we provide as Calleva Networks. So my name's Paul Roberts. I'm Managing Director of Calleva Networks. And this was a short presentation that I ran just to welcome and introduce people to the day. So we started off with a slide just asking why are we here today. So the idea was at the event, the attendees would learn a little bit about the importance of core network services. Now that's something I'm going to talk in more detail about in a moment, but fundamentally we're talking about DNS, DHCP and IP address management. Also, it was about how to detect and prevent threats once people have connected to the network. And that was basically to do with a technology that we were presenting called Net Clarity, which is an agentless NAC solution. And because we were hosting the event at Vinopolis, which is actually a wine merchants, they do like a wine tasting experience. So the first part of the day was to run through these presentations, and then the second part was to enjoy some fine wines. And that actually went down really well with the attendees. Everybody enjoyed it, everybody that turned up. So who are we? Well, we're called Calleva Networks. Our business is based around fundamentally core network services. So we've got specialists that have got many years experience of deploying core network services. So that's things like DNS and DHCP servers. So we wanted to base a business on that core technology because everybody uses it. It's so fundamental to the network these days. So I've been myself dealing with core network services since the mid-90s. And what we do is we add on some complementary products. So on top of core network services, we can add IP address management, which is kind of like the process you use to manage your core network services and provide all the IP address management and all the integration. And again, I've been involved with those sorts of products since the late 90s. So really, we were trying to, base the business on our fundamental expertise. But the idea was to add complementary products around the core network services theme. So for instance, when we look at security, that's where the network access control comes in. So I'll be talking about an agentless network access control product that we've got. And the third part of the jigsaw is really to do with connectivity. So again, wireless is a good, is a big part of that, of a huge market, growth market as well. There's so many devices going into the network these days. And of course, they all require DNS and DHCP. And in fact, if you're rolling out a large wireless network with hundreds of access points, you will more than likely need a resilient DHCP service. So wireless and core network services go extremely well together. Now, as I mentioned, we've got many years experience, probably about 30 years combined experience from myself and my colleagues, deploying core network services across all verticals. And ultimately this stuff runs, it runs the largest banks in the world. So we've got experience of deploying in banks, insurance, telcos, utilities, manufacturers, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of different verticals. And we are the only specialists in this field, the only dedicated specialists, because our business is fundamentally based upon core network services. Whereas you'll find other people doing similar products and services have got more of a focus on other areas. For instance, security. They might focus more on security, but do IP address management and core network services as a more of a sideline. And we can provide a complete wraparound service. So we can provide not only the products themselves, but also the professional services to help you project manage and deploy these solutions, as well as training and post-sales support and ongoing, support and consulting. Now, I've got a little bit of techie speak. I've already been talking about core network services. So what am I actually talking about? Well, probably the first one is DNS, which basically stands for the domain name system. And this is what everything uses to convert a host name into an IP address. Now, as humans, we're not very good at remembering large quantities of numbers. So an IP address, basically all these numbers, is quite difficult to memorize. You can probably remember a few of them, but in a large corporate environment, you need some way of remembering what the printer's called or some sort of application. So you tend to use names. But obviously computers aren't very good with names. They want to have numbers. So DNS basically converts that name into a number or an IP address that a computer can understand. And this is obviously going to become incredibly important when IPv6 really takes off, because you might be familiar with the traditional IPv4 address today, which is just 4 numbers separated by dots. Now an IPv6 address is a lot longer and also uses letters as well. So it's based on hexadecimal, incredibly difficult to memorize. In fact, nigh on impossible. So DNS is going to become absolutely critical when IPv6 is used a lot more. So the next part of the jigsaw is DHCP, which is the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Now again, this is a very fundamental service. It's what everything uses to obtain its IP address automatically. So for instance, your laptop or your tablet or your phone, even when you're at home, you'll use DHCP to get an IP address. So you'll find there's a DHCP server built into your wireless router at home, or your ADSL router, for instance. So all you have to do is just take that concept and scale it up for the enterprise, who've got thousands and thousands of desktops and laptops and tablets, and you can see that DHCP is pretty crucial to getting access to the network, which is why you'd want to have a resilient DHCP service. And finally, we've got IP address management, which is the methodology for managing your IP addresses and your subnets and all your assignments, and optimally integrating into DNS and DHCP. So you've got kind of like a one-touch process where you can assign an IP address and it automatically gets pushed out to DNS and DHCP. So you just do it once instead of three separate tasks. So those 3 services, DNS, DHCP, IP address management, obviously are incredibly critical. When you look at today's networks, you've got a whole bunch of different applications and different types of networks. And you've got clients trying to access the network and those applications. And fundamentally, they all rely on these network services. So DNS and DHCP are the main ones, but there's some other ones as well, NTP and TFTP, for instance. So if you imagine, say, DNS or DHCP goes down, or you have a failure or some kind of outage, straight away you'll start having massive problems with people not being able to access their favorite applications. So, for instance, they won't be able to access your SAP or ERP system, or they won't be able to send any emails or access the intranet, or even the VoIP phones. You have a power glitch and all the VoIP phones have to reboot. If your DHCP server's down as well, then they can't get an IP address and you can't get back onto the network. So you can see straight away that DNS, DHCP, IP address management is absolutely fundamental to the smooth running of the network, absolutely critical. So there's various challenges around what we call DDI, so that's DNS, DHCP, IP address management. That's kind of like a new acronym. Mainly around ensuring continuity, service delivery, and also managing heterogeneous services. So you might have DNS, DHCP running on a mixture of Windows and Linux boxes, or appliances as well. So you need some way of managing all that. You want to ensure there's no inconsistencies between what your IP address plan is saying and what's actually in DNS and DHCP. So that's why you integrate them. Obviously, you can streamline resource qualification and consumption. You can do delegation and control access to different parts of the IP address plan. The other thing you can do is control the divergence between what you're planning and what the reality is. So you can get tools that actually compare what's actually out on the network with what you planned. So get a good picture of the reality versus theory. And obviously you also need to simplify updates, upgrades, and also help with the backups and disaster recovery planning. So quite a few things to take into consideration when you're doing this all by hand, using manual methods. And in fact, the Enterprise Strategy Group came up with the statistics that back in 2009 that 50% of companies with 1,000 employees or more have faced some kind of network outage due to DNS or DHCP. And even Microsoft themselves have previously stated that a large percentage of Active Directory related issues can normally be tracked or traced down to DNS misconfigurations or inconsistencies. Now all of this has a cost associated with it. The average cost works out around about, there's been various studies, works out around about $8 per IP address is the average, but and that's not just about the cost of the hardware or the provision of the service. You've obviously got all the bureaucracy around that, things like change control processes and all the planning, the ongoing maintenance and troubleshooting, and upgrades, and it takes into account all the the personnel costs as well, all sorts of costs. And what we can do is we can get that cost down by deploying an automated IPAM solution that removes a lot of the complexity, because as networks get more complex, that cost does go up. So if we take a look at what sort of IPAM solution you might be using today, what we tend to find is a lot of people are still using Excel spreadsheets, and that is actually our #1 competitor. Now the problem is with spreadsheets is they're fine for small environments, but as they grow, as the company grows and you get up to a certain size, let's say you do some kind of merger or acquisition, or you're deploying so a lot of cloud computing or a lot of virtual machines, these spreadsheets can get incredibly complicated with numerous tabs along the bottom or multiple individual worksheets. They tend to be stored centrally, obviously, but Excel only lets one person have write access. So the second person opens it, they only need to track down the first person that's got it open so that they can then close it and then they can save it. Or they'll probably more than likely just save another copy. Even worse, they might save a copy locally. Before you know it, you've got inconsistencies with numerous different versions of the spreadsheets and conflicting data. So spreadsheets do get incredibly unwieldy as well after a while with so many rows. And the other problem, obviously, you've got is the delegation. So how do you actually delegate portions of that IP address plan to, say, some administrator out in a different country? And that's where you probably end up having multiple spreadsheets. Obviously, there's open source solutions out there as well that you can get, but they do tend to be limited with certain features. And obviously, you're dependent on the open source community for support and bug fixes and feature requests as well. You might have an in-house system that somebody's written. We see this quite a lot. But what tends to happen is the person that wrote the system, with the best will in the world, did a cracking job, but they've since left and moved on. There's no one left that knows how the system was coded or how it works. And trying to implement new features can be quite difficult. So you end up with an in-house system that can't be upgraded or expanded or modified to take advantage of the latest features, such as, for instance, IPv6, for instance, or maybe you need to add some additional fields to take account of virtual computing. You might be using a feature of another product. So if you've got an extensive wireless infrastructure, you might find there's an IPAM capability built into that. Or even Microsoft itself, you might be using DNS and DHCP, the MMC snap-ins, but they don't really provide an IPAM capability. There's still nowhere where you can just document like subnet allocations or static addresses. Or I could be preaching to the converted, and you might already have a commercial solution. Now the DDI market's growing. The DDI is this phrase that Gartner coined back in 2009 when they wrote their first market scope report. They've been producing market scope reports every year since. Now DDI doesn't have a magic quadrant yet. I believe that the market needs to be worth $1 billion in order for Gartner to produce a magic quadrant. But the market is growing, and both Gartner and IDC are predicting annual growth of greater than 20%. In fact, it grew by about 26% last year. The market's currently worth between $400 and $500 million. So it's quite small compared to the security market. I mean, I think the global security market is worth about 60 billion. So it is quite a small market. It's quite niche. As you can see, it's fundamentally important to the network and is growing. And Gartner themselves are stating that 75% of enterprises are still using manual IPAM methods, such as spreadsheets. So one of the reasons why the market is growing like that is, as well as things like cloud computing and acquisitions and mergers, IPv6, we've got BYOD, of course, the proliferation of devices on the network. And in fact, some studies have been done. There's loads of studies out there, but this is one of the more general ones. 74% of companies allow some sort of BYOD usage at work. And I've witnessed that myself, even at my previous employer. People were bringing in their own phones. As soon as they got a phone upgrade that had wireless built in, they were trying to attach it to the network. But less than 10% of companies are actually fully aware of the devices that are accessing their network. And 81% of employees use at least one device for business use. And that could be as simple as just checking email. In fact, that's probably the biggest driver. So BYOD is a massive growth area and is unstoppable. Gartner predicts by 2017 that half of employers will require employees to supply their own devices for work purposes, which is absolutely staggering. But again, there's been numerous studies that says, if an employee owns the device and the company doesn't have to provide that, then they can gain a significant cost saving. Although we should imagine that most companies will subsidize these devices to some extent. But it's going to be interesting to see whether that actually becomes true. We're only talking 3-4 years away. So that's going to put a massive emphasis on technology such as mobile device management and ultimately what we hope we're presenting here today, a NAC solution. Now, one of the issues with bring your own device obviously is malware. And one of the problems we've got is, or one of the growth areas we've seen is with Android. Just the sheer growth in malware on Android is incredible. And Trend Micro have done some studies, and they reckon that by the end of 2013, they'll have seen at least 1 million different types of Android malware. Now, even on iOS, there's issues with malware. It's probably not as bad as Android because obviously iOS is a lot more closed down thanks to the Apple's policy of vetting everything that goes into the iTunes store or the App Store. But you've still got issues with things like jailbroken phones. So people bring in their Apple devices onto your corporate network, and they've got jailbroken phones with all sorts of dodgy software on there. You've got no idea what they're doing. So multiple issues to consider with a BYOD policy. How do you find out what's on your network? Who is on your network? What do you do about malware? And also vulnerabilities. So this is like exploitable vulnerabilities that malware might use to infect devices. Of course, what you've got is people bringing devices onto the network that could have been infected at home. So they're bypassing your IDS and IPS and your firewall and your antivirus and everything, connecting straight to your Wi-Fi, and then they could be talking to a botnet or command and control server. So how do you secure your corporate and guest wireless? And with the introduction of 802.11ac, which provides gigabit wireless speeds, we could see the end of flood wiring in office blocks now, and every device just using wireless and high density access points in the ceilings. And if you do still use wired RJ45 Ethernet ports, then how do you secure those? You may have an environment whether you think you've got a secure network with a lab or a data center. You might be locking down switch ports via ACLs based on MAC address, but if someone spoofs a MAC address, let's say they unplug a printer, plug a device in, spoof the MAC address, they're straight back onto the network again. So, there are solutions out there. The one that we've got will actually detect that because it fingerprints the device. If it sees a device changed, even though they're spoofing the MAC address, it can block it. So what we're ultimately doing is showcasing two solutions when we ran the Vinopolis event. The first one was DNS, DHCP, and IP address management from a company called Efficient IP. And the second was an agentless network access control product from a company called NetClarity. So there's two other presentations that talk about these two solutions, which hopefully you can find on our YouTube channel. That concludes my presentation. So thank you for watching. If you need to get in touch, you can contact me at my email address, paul@callevanetworks.com.